Hi everyone, have you ever noticed that some spells in Classic seem to either do nothing or absolutely delete you with no in between, while others seem to get partially resisted? That's what I want to explain today. In the last video, we talked about the attack table, crits, crushing blows, defense, and how tanks deal with physical damage, but that only solves one part of the problem, because some of the most dangerous damage in Classic is magical, and that follows different rules entirely. So here's what we're covering. Binary versus non-binary spells, how resistance works, resistance breakpoints, when Thrash gets involved, my approach, and when resistance fails entirely. First, let's quickly cover how spells are categorized in Classic and the difference between them. A binary spell is a spell that's all or nothing. It either fully hits or fully resists. There's no partial result in the middle. A non-binary spell is different. These can partially resist for different amounts of damage. And if we look at fights like Ragnaros, we can see good examples for both. A binary spell here is Wrath of Ragnaros. When Wrath lands, it deals fire damage and knocks players back. Because the spell has a knockback attached to it, the game has to treat it as all or nothing. It can't partially apply a knockback. You either resist it, or you take the full damage and Ragnaros helps with your positioning. A non-binary spell here is Elemental Fire. This one is just damage. There's no knockback, silence, or any control effect attached to it, so the game doesn't have to treat it as all or nothing. It can let the damage come through at different strengths depending on your resistance. So if we put them side by side, the game is essentially rolling to answer Wrath of Ragnaros as, does this happen at all? And Elemental Fire as, how bad is this hit going to be? Now that we've covered how spells are categorized in Classic, we can talk about what resistance actually does. And this is because resistance doesn't reduce spells the same way armor reduces melee. It changes the outcome of the spell instead. So as it increases, we start to see more resists in our favour, and this brings me on to two resistance numbers that are worth remembering. The first is 210, and this is an important number for non-binary spells. At 210 resistance, a full hit is no longer possible. So in our earlier Elemental Fire example, we will now always resist at least 25% of the damage. This is relevant for Warlocks on fights like Twin Emperors when they're tanking, because once they reach 210 shadow resistance, the shadow balls can no longer hit them for the full amount. Then as resistance increases, we eventually reach 315, and this is the cap against raid bosses. So resistance can help influence the outcomes in our favour, but it's not a guarantee. It also doesn't stop everything else happening around the spell. We can still lose a lot of health quickly if we get a series of bad resistance rolls followed by a combination of other attacks. And fortunately for this video, I have a good example of exactly this, with Firemore trying to combo me back to Elwyn.
Remember to build up my fire resistance gear before fighting fire.
At this point, it feels less like a boss mechanic and more like Firemore has a personal vendetta against me. If you look at logs, you will see that where there's instances where Shadow Flame lands, there's multiple melee events almost immediately after, and this is possible for bosses with Thrash or double attacks. This causes the damage to get compressed into a very small window, and these can all get stacked right on top of each other. And if we're unlucky on our Flame Buffet stacks, this can tick at the same time too, because apparently the first problem was feeling lonely. So how can we survive a situation like this? We can Holy Shield before the Shadow Flame lands, as this will help with the melee that comes right after, and then we want to plan for anything else we can do in that moment. If we get a bad set of resistance rolls and high Flame Buffet stacks, it becomes even more important to plan for things such as a Priest Shield going into the cast, or using protection potions where possible. And this is why, even in resistance gear, I still care about maintaining 42.4% avoidance, so that I can reach the avoidance cap with Holy Shield and Redoubt, while still prioritising as much stamina as I can. And then, in some moments, when we're not actively tanking, such as during the Buffet window, we can use Bubble too. So here the timing is good, and it's safe for me to bubble the stacks off and rejoin the threat table. But this isn't always possible. And this brings me on to one final part I'd like to cover. Sometimes, resistance just doesn't interact with the mechanic at all. A good example of that is the Blackwing Lair technicians. Apparently, they read the resistance mechanic and decided it wasn't for them. So that's why, in these situations, it's better to gear for stamina and use a fire protection potion instead. And this isn't just a trash mechanic thing either. There are also later raid abilities that also ignore resistance completely. Things like Sapphiron's Ice Bolt or Lotheb's Inevitable Doom. These are much more niche examples though, so I only want to mention them briefly here, but just having an awareness of this can be useful. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I wanted to make sure I covered the important points properly, and Royal Giraffe's resistance guide was a big help when putting this together. I've linked it in the description below, along with the other sources that I used. Now that the foundations have been covered, in the next few videos I want to go into how much defense you really need as a paladin when balancing that readout window, and more specific topics such as gearing and hardcore dungeon and raid guides. If there's anything specific you want me to cover, please let me know in the comments below. Until then, I will see you in the next one.